All right. So I hope that everybody found the first problem set to be reasonable, and they should all have been handed in at this point. And one other announcement in the ongoing saga of the timing and location of the sections. The latest update is they have moved the room for the 1:30 Tuesday section, that is today's 1:30 section, and it is now going to be
LC 103. Yes.
All right, well, great. And there may be a room change to one of the either the 4 or 5 p.m. Wednesday section, and if that happens, we will let you know with the emails. Okay, so last class we talked about the Nash equilibrium concept, how to figure out what people should do, assuming everyone is rational and self-interested, which is a sort of classical economics approach to things, and saw how that actually organized the data that you guys produced in class, in the previous class pretty well. And then we went on to talk about behavioral economics and social preferences. Social preferences being this sort of standard approach in behavioral economics for explaining why people do things that aren't consistent with rational self-interest. The basic idea was this utility theory. Someone has a set of options, and you get a certain amount of utility from each option. And then what it means to be rational, basically, is to pick the one that maximizes your utility. We didn't say this explicitly, but last class, but the idea for the utility theory is that utility is this thing that has intangible units. It's not like, it's literally dollars or whatever. It's just the internal currency with which you compare different options and choose. And there actually is some neuroscience trying to show that there is actually literally in the brain some kind of thing that is analogous to a unitless utility currency. But for our purposes, the thing that matters is that is what goes into that utility function, the thing that you're trying to maximize. And so your preferences are defined as the things that you get utility from. I'm just going to get some utility out of it, less noise. What that means is it's the terms in your utility function. And so the classic economic rational self-interest model, homo economicus, as they say, it's a very simple utility function, which is just your payoff. And so that's the simplest possible version of utility theory. You just care about your monetary payoff, and you choose the option that maximizes it. And there's all kinds of other things that you might care about, but the thing that we are particularly going to focus on here, and that we talked about last class, is social preferences. That is to say, other terms in your utility function that involve other people in some way or other. And so there was 3 different kinds of social preferences that we talked about. There's altruism. So an altruist utility function is their payoff plus some constant times the partner's payoff. There's fairness or inequity aversion, where your payoff, the utility function is your payoff minus some constant times the amount more than you, the partner, has, minus some other constant times the amount more you have than the other person. And in general, we said people dislike it more when the partner has more than when they have more, which is to say alpha tends to be larger than beta. And then there's reciprocity, which is to say that your utility function is your monetary payoff plus a constant times this sort of more ambiguous thing that's defined in different ways in specific reciprocity models, usually in a very complicated way, but it basically boils down to, did you act reciprocally. Were you nice if the other person behaved nicely, or if you think the other person is of a nice type? Were you mean if the other person was mean to you, or if you think the other person is of a mean type? And in section this week, you're going to dig a bit more into some of these preference models. But they've been hugely influential in the last maybe 20-ish years in behavioral economics, where people started, that is for a while, the response of the game theory type people to people not fitting Nash equilibrium was just a real insistence that people just weren't paying attention, and if you made the stakes higher or let people play for long enough, they would always do Nash. And then maybe 20 years ago, there was an admission of, okay, fine, people actually do care about things other than just the amount of money they have. And these are the favorite ones. But first of all, one thing to point out is that these are not mutually exclusive. Like you could have all of these different kinds of terms in your utility function. You could be, you care about your payoff, and you care to some extent about altruism, and you care to some extent about fairness, and you care to some extent about reciprocity. And so one vision of human social behavior is that, basically. You've got a bunch of different specific things that you care about. You care about each of those specific things to some specified extent, and then your choice is just balancing between those different options. And that's the way it's typically talked about in the context of behavioral economics. But what I will argue is that although these models are useful, there's this awesome quote by this guy, George Box. It says, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And the core idea of that quote is that what a model means is an abstraction. Right? To create a model, something is to say, I want something that's simple and that captures some key elements that I care about. And so that's what these preference models are doing. Is they are, getting some core thing that people care about in a moral domain and expressing it in a simple way and showing, hey, look, this can predict behavior across a lot of different experiments. But what I've argued in a recent paper is that I don't think that people actually have a utility function that have these different terms, like I care this amount about altruism, I care this amount about fairness, and let's balance them. But instead, people basically just have a preference for doing the right thing. And people vary in how much they care about doing the right thing. But really what it is, they want to say, in this situation, what's the right thing to do? And then how much is it worth to me to sacrifice in order to do the right thing? And in order to figure out what the right thing is, we use things like the payoff to the other person, the level of inequality, the extent to which you reciprocate, as sort of cues to what's right or wrong. But it's not that you really care about those things per se. And just as a little demonstration of this, with my collaborator Valerio Cuparo, we did this experiment where we had people play two different games. They played a prisoner's dilemma where they just chose cooperate or defect. And then they also played this thing we call the trade-off game. It's a 3-player game, and you get to just unilaterally decide between two different options. In one option, all 3 people get 13 units each, and in the other one, you get 15, the second person gets 13, and the third person gets 23. We just kind of pick these numbers fairly arbitrarily, but the point is this option is equitable, because there's no fairness, there's no unfairness, there's no inequality. So an equity aversion would say, oh, I like this one. There's no psychological pain that comes from unfairness existing. Whereas altruism would favor this one, because if you care about the payoff the other people are getting, here the other people are getting 13 plus 23, whereas here the other people are only getting 13 plus 13. And so what we want to do is we want to say, how do the choices that people make in the trade-off game predict the choices they make in the prisoner's dilemma? And if it was just that, cooperation in the prisoner's dilemma is motivated by inequity aversion, then you should expect people that are more likely to choose the sort of equitable choice will cooperate more. Or if cooperation is driven by altruism, you should expect people that choose the sort of more altruistic option to cooperate more. or if it's some mix, then maybe you'll get a wash.
Will someone argue that the second game is all self-interest and all?
Yes. So but the key point is that if you think that there are stable preferences for an equity aversion or altruism, whatever, you should see some kind of stable correlation between play in this game and play in this game. That will depend on what the preferences are. But what we did is we experimentally manipulated the framing of the trade-off game. And so in one version, half the people, we said, okay, you start with this payoff distribution of 15, 13, 23, and you have the choice to do nothing or to be nice and equalize the payoffs by switching it to the 13, 13, 13 outcome. And the other half of the people have said, it starts with 13, 13, 13, and if you want, you can be nice and give more money both to yourself and to player 3 and switch it to the 15, 13, 23 outcome. And so the idea is that if what people care about is doing the right thing, that if what motivates you to cooperate is the desire to do the right thing rather than a specific caring about these preferences, then it's not going to be that cooperators systematically prefer either the fair option or this sort of higher total payoff option. But instead, the framing is going to totally change it. And so when the equitable choice is the one that's presented as nice, then cooperators are going to be more likely to choose the equitable thing. And when this kind of self-interested or altruistic choice is the one that's presented as being the one that's sort of nice and morally right, then cooperators will do that. And that's exactly what we see. So this is data from a few hundred people that we recruited online to do this experiment. And here I'm showing you the fraction of people that choose to cooperate as a function of whether they chose the 13, 13, 13 equal payoff or the 15, 13, 23 sort of altruistic or self-interested payoff. And then also, this is based on how it's framed. And so what you see is when you frame the game as equalizing, that is, you say you can do nothing or you can be nice and choose the equal option, then the people that choose the equal option are much more likely to cooperate than the people that choose the sort of self-interested and altruistic option. Whereas when you flip the framing to say, do you want to be nice by giving more to yourself than the other person, the opposite is true, and you get a full crossover. That cooperators are, basically roughly twice as likely to choose the option that's presented as nice, regardless of whether it's more efficient or more equitable, that is more altruistic or more equitable. And so what this says is that those models aren't literally what's going on. It's not literally that you have these preferences, but rather that they're part of what matters. And so in normal games like a prisoner's dilemma or just how much money do you want to keep for yourself, give to someone else, these preference models do a good job of explaining what's going on because there's no ambiguity about what the right thing to do is. You can either do the selfish thing or you can do this thing that's pro-social in some way or other. And so those standard experiments make it look like people have these kind of fixed preferences. But what we show here is that when you create ambiguity, like in this trade-off game, it's ambiguous whether the equal or the sort of higher payoff for everyone options is better. When there's that ambiguity, then the framing is really important because it's not obvious to people just based on the payoffs what's the right thing to do. So anyways, you don't need to know this in great detail. The point is just that we should think of these social preference models as useful models, but not literally the psychology of pro-sociality. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to reflect on different levels of analysis. So these social preference models are trying to describe how people make decisions in some kind of quantitative way. And that can be useful if you're interested in predicting what people are going to do, and if you're interested in understanding sort of commonalities across different experiments. But these models that are sort of economic models don't say anything about the psychology of how these preferences are implemented. That is, is it like that you get mad when you see unfairness, and the sort of anger is the psychological process that motivates you to do it, or some principle, higher reasoning principles about fairness, or whatever. You could sort of have whole research programs in psychology trying to understand what are the psychological mechanisms leading to these behaviors. But then there's even this higher level question of where do the preferences come from, and where does that psychology come from? That is to say, what's the ultimate explanation of why is it that we should have psychology in the first place that leads us to make decisions like this? And that's the sort of evolutionary question. It's most this distinction is associated with Tinbergen, and it makes this distinction between proximate and ultimate. So proximate causation is immediate causes, things like how the trait or behavior works, what stimuli cause it to occur, what biological or cognitive implementations underlie it, and that's in contrast to ultimate causation, which is fundamentally a historical sort of question, which is to say, why did this trait or behavior arise? Why was it adaptive? What function did it serve for survival or reproduction? And this distinction between proximate causes and ultimate causes is this core central tenet of evolutionary biology, but it is constantly mixed up in the social sciences and in discussions of human behavior. And so what my goal for the rest of this lecture is to try and make clear this distinction between proximate causation and ultimate causation, so that for the rest of this class, as we're mostly focusing on ultimate causation, we're keeping in mind that this is different from the proximate psychological causes of the behavior. So the way that Tinbergen does it is he breaks it down. He's got these 4 questions. He claims there's 2 different kinds of proximate explanation and 2 different kinds of ultimate explanation. So he's got the mechanism, that is, what are the factors that actually cause the behavior, and then the question of how the behavior develops during over the course of a lifetime, which is ontogeny. And then the ultimate questions are, what is the behavior's survival value? So, what's its function? What is it that made it adaptive? And then how did the behavior actually evolve in terms of, descent, and which gene, how is the gene passed from one version of the animal to the other, and so on, and phylogeny. And I think for the purpose of this class, just differentiating between these different levels, these sort of sub-questions between proximate and ultimate is not super critical. It's also interesting to think about in the context of human behavior, this step of how does the behavior develop during the individual's lifetime, Tinbergen claims is proximate. But if you're thinking about cultural evolution and sort of learning and imitation as domains in which natural selection is operating, which I very much do and we'll talk a lot about in the class, this can also be a step in which ultimate causation is happening. That is, if you learn to do something because that behavior is ultimately payoff maximizing, then there's an ultimate cause for you coming to have that behavior. There's still a why question. You can still ask, what is the value of that behavior for explaining why it arose? It's just with arising through a learning process rather than through an evolutionary process. Okay, so what I'm going to do is give some examples. So birds flying, pretty sweet. I think well-recognized, awesome thing that happens. And if you're a biologist interested in birds flying and you want to study it, there's different ways you could do it. So one proximate question would be like, how does the bird actually flap its wing? Like what muscle is attached to what bone, and how does it work to actually get the air flapping and get the bird generating lift and so on. Or another question might be, so I didn't know this until I started, doing some background research for this class, but I guess birds don't know how to fly when they're born, and they have to learn from their parents. So this sweet little baby owl doesn't know how to fly and has to watch mommy and daddy fly to figure it out. And so that's another sort of proximate question of how does the bird fly? Well, it learns from its parents. But the ultimate question is not these things, but like, why is it sweet to fly? Like, why is it worth putting, why did natural selection cause owls to invest this huge amount of energy and time into learning how to fly? And there's lots of answers, but one of it is like, it makes it easier to kill stuff. Or eat, whatever. It's hard to see. It's like it's capturing a snake. I try to use only images that are like the open access or whatever, the Creative Commons licensing thing, which means sometimes it's harder to find sweet images. But anyway, there's a little snake in there that guy's about to eat. Because he could fly, he could swoop down and get it. Okay, so that's a little bit of ultimate proximate distinction for flying. Another bird example is migration. So migration is another really amazing thing that birds have evolved to do. And there's a proximate question that I think the first thing, at least for me, that comes to mind when I think about migration is how the hell do they do it, right? Like, just from a proximate perspective, how do they figure out what's the right direction to fly and, get these thousands of miles and so on? And so that's like a proximate implementation question. Another proximate question that is cool for purposes of cooperation is, what is the actual arrangement? How's the arrangement of the birds in the V figured out? And it turns out that this is actually a bit of a prisoner's dilemma because when you fly, basically this guy is sort of like separating the air with himself or herself, and so the other birds, if you're flying behind another bird, it's easier to fly and sort of you use less calories to go, and so everyone would rather be that guy in the back than the guy in the front. And so the question is, how do you solve this social dilemma? And I think that the answer is some sort of reciprocity, that basically they switch out roles, and there must be some kind of, if you don't take your turn in the front, something bad must happen to you, kind of thing. But again, these are both proximate questions. And the ultimate question is, why do they do this crazy thing that requires such a vast infrastructure to support as well as energy to actually do? Again, this is limited quality images, although this one maybe is funny, that they do it to get fat or to have good access to food. That I guess for a lot of these birds, the things that they like to eat the most are in the northern hemisphere, but then when it gets cold, all the food dies. And so they fly south to find better food, and then they come back once the food is there. At least that's what the internet told me. I don't study birds, despite using 2 bird examples here. But whatever the answer is, the point is the ultimate question is, why? What's the function of this? A cool biological example from humans is sickle cell anemia. It's this disease that is very bad to have, where normal blood cells, the way that the body works is you have blood cells and they have iron in them and they absorb oxygen and then they take it somewhere else and they drop it off, and that's great. But when you have sickle cell anemia, the blood cells are like shaped wrong, and they don't work nearly as well, and there's all kinds of negative biological consequences. And because this is a medical problem, there's lots of people studying it, and sort of proximate questions are like, what, how does it work? Well, okay, there are these strands that cause a bind of different size that cause it to have this weird shape, so that's like a proximate explanation. Or there's some gene that they've identified that is the gene that's responsible for this occurring. But the ultimate question is, why does this exist in humans? It seems like there should be natural selection against this gene, because the gene causes these bad, health outcomes, and so why is it that's persisted? And the thing that's cool is it turns out that, as everybody knows, I hope, you have 2 copies of every gene, one from each parent. And so it turns out that for sickle cell anemia, this bad thing only happens when you have 2 copies of the bad gene. So if you're homozygous for the bad version of the gene, you get this negative consequence. But if you're heterozygous for it, that is to say, if you have one version of the normal gene and one version of the sort of the messed up version of the gene, it's actually good for you, and it provides resistance against malaria. And so there's selection, there's natural selection to maintain this gene in the gene pool, because in the heterozygous form, it gives this fitness benefit. So this is an ultimate explanation for why this thing is still around. Okay, so now moving into human social behavior, a major part of human behavior is taking care of your kids. And so you could say, why do we do it? It requires a massive amount of investment. And I was up for like 3.5 hours last night. And it was not that fun. But you could say, oh, well, I do it because I love my kids. Because they're very cute, and who couldn't love them, right? And that is a thing, and there's lots of people in psychology that study love and all of the psychological dynamics of love and so on and so forth. You could also have a different kind of biological approximate explanation, which is like, oh, when I look at his cute little face, various hormones get released in my body, and I think, oh, I should take care of this kid and what have you. But the ultimate question is, why should we have evolved to do this? And this one, I think, is pretty straightforward, which is the core unit of fitness is the survival and success of your offspring. And so there's very clear, direct natural selection to take care of your kids. Because if you didn't, they would die, and then your genes would die, and then that would be the end of those genes. So there's very clear, strong genetic selection in favor of taking care of your kids. Another one that has received a lot of attention in a bunch of different literatures, and that's another sort of core element of human behavior or social dynamics, is friendship. Okay, so you guys, I hope all have good friends, and some features of friends are that you really like them a lot, and you're willing to do things to sacrifice for them, and you're often willing to do it without, lots of cost and benefit calculations. Well, how much is it going to cost me? How much is it going to benefit them? What's the likelihood that we're going to interact again in the future and that they're going to pay it back, so forth. But you just kind of feel like, oh yeah, sure, I'll help you out. Like, you have this kind of automatic, uncalculating, cooperative response to say, sure. And so if you're a psychologist studying proximate psychology, you want to know things like, well, what makes people more or less likely to be friends? So things like group membership. If you're a part of the same group with someone, that's, creates bonds and makes you more likely to be friends with them. And there's whole literatures in social psychology studying that kind of thing. Or you could say biologically, like, how does it work? And there's tons of neuroimaging studies about like which brain lights up when you drink beer with your friends at rock shows and things like that. And that's, again, a proximate type question. But then you can have the ultimate question of what's the adaptive value of friendship, as opposed to just, well, there's some people that I have productive relationships with, and I will help you as long as you help me, and so on. Like, would it be good to have this extra kind of just like uncalculated, all right, you're my buddy, I'll help you out. And there's cool evolutionary game theory work that we may talk a little bit about later that suggests that there is an ultimate explanation involving reciprocity, which is that basically if situations vary in how costly it is to help the other person or how big the temptation to screw the other person over is, then you can have selection favor a strategy that says, I will help you without, stopping to think about the cost. Just be like, you're my buddy. If you need help, I'll help you. As long as you also take the same behavior towards me. And even if you're cooperating with me, but you're stopping to check the cost and benefits every time, I'll say, I don't want to interact with you again, because I know that in the future, if you do the calculation and you come to the conclusion that you're better off not helping me or taking advantage of me, you will. And so there can be these reputational benefits to uncalculated cooperation. Okay, so these are a few different examples across a lot of different levels of the natural world of this distinction between the proximate and the ultimate. And so, it's important to remember these things, but I think the key point that I want to make that I feel like gets mixed up a lot is that the existence of an ultimate explanation for behavior doesn't undermine the proximate psychology that is driving that behavior. You can still honestly experience things like love, you can honestly care about the well-being of others, all of these things, even if there's some ultimate reason that it's in your long-run self-interest to engage in these behaviors. Like with the friends, I can still really honestly care about my friends or really honestly love my son, even though there are long-run benefits to doing so. And so I think this is something that gets mixed up a lot. Is people will say, oh, if the evolutionary theory is saying that that it was adaptive to do this, that there was some benefit to doing it, that means that it's not really altruistic, or that people don't really care, they're only doing it because of these long-run benefits. But that's not true. The point of these different levels of analysis is that you can have this ultimate level explanation that drives the emergence of the proximate explanation that then is itself totally a real thing. And this is in contrast to actual strategic reasoning, which does undermine other proximate psychological motives. And that is to say that consciously trying to maximize your payoff is itself a proximate motivation. So if I think to myself, I better help this person out and I better not seem like I'm calculating, because if I stop and calculate it, they won't help me in the future when I need it. That means you're doing it because you did a strategic calculation and said, look, there's a reputation benefit to it, not because you really felt some honest desire to help the other person. And so this is, for me, this is a key distinction, that ultimate causation is not an alternative explanation for proximate psychology. Instead, they're complementary, and this is because they're existing at different levels of analysis and over different timescales. That the ultimate explanation is historical, whereas the proximate psychological explanation is sort of immediate and in the moment. Whereas strategic reasoning is an alternate because it is also an immediate thing, and it's a motivation that takes the place of these other kinds of psychology. I basically said this, but just as an excuse to show these cute pictures again, it's I do really love my son. I feel this really deep emotion, and the fact that if I didn't take care of him, my wife would get really pissed at me, and therefore there is also strategic motives to take care of him, either can or cannot undermine the claim that I love him, depending on how it works. If it's something where there's this long-term historical thing that led to me developing this true sense of love, and now when I decide to take care of him, it really is just because I want to help this thing, then there is a real motive. But there may be other situations in which I think, he's fine. He doesn't really need this extra thing that's going to be a pain in my ass to do, but I know that she will really be upset if I don't do it, so okay, fine, I'll do it. And in that case, it is strategic, and there, I would not be justified in saying, I do this because I love my son. Really, there's this other motive going on. And you can think about the same thing in the friend example. Sometimes you help your friends because you really care about them and they need it, and you really do feel honestly motivated to help them. And other times you think to yourself, if I don't do this favor to my friend when he needs it, next time they want to go out, I'm probably not going to be invited, so I better do this thing. And so you can have, for the same type of behavior, you can have sometimes sort of legitimate, sort of pro-social, psychological motives that are the result of long-run historical selective forces, or other times you can have actual strategic immediate motives that aren't driven by real prosociality. And so for the rest of this class, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. That is, different things that make cooperation advantageous, adaptive, long-run payoff maximizing, things like that. And most of the things that we are going to talk about can operate at either of these two different levels. Either you can have real ultimate causation, evolution, cultural learning, and so on, or they can work in terms of strategic reasoning. And this is the kind of evolutionary game theory versus regular game theory. This is the kind of stuff that the evolutionary biologists are thinking about, and this is the kind of stuff that the economic game theorists are thinking about. And for most of these mechanisms, because it's basically about calculating Nash equilibria, and as we talked about last time, Nash equilibrium is the thing that you arrive at either through strategic reasoning or through evolutionary processes, just by saying, well, there's people do this thing, and look, here's a mechanism that explains it, that doesn't let you differentiate between these different kinds of explanations. And the thing that I'm a big advocate of for how you can try and differentiate between these two different types of explanations is you see what happens if you take people and you put them in an atypical situation where the benefits don't exist anymore, and then see if they change their behavior or not. So, for example, in the context of this uncalculating cooperation, that is this willingness to help other people without carefully thinking through it, if you have people playing some kind of, say you bring them to the lab and you have them play a repeated game where, each round there's some temptation to take advantage of the other person. You can choose to find out what the temptation is or not, and then you can choose to help or not. And then the person gets to say, do I want to keep playing this game with you or not? And they can condition that based on whether you looked at the temptation and on whether you helped. The idea is, if you're going to do this repeatedly with the same person for a long time, that person can have an incentive to say, I don't want to play the game again with you, even if you helped me, if you looked, because then I know that next time, if you look and you realize it's actually good to take advantage of me, you will, and so I don't want to play the game with you. And so there's a clear strategic motive to do it, and if you see people engaging in this cooperating without looking, it could be that they have some real hardwired psychology that makes them want to cooperate without looking, or it could just be that they're doing some strategic calculation and figuring out what makes sense in this game. And so instead, what you want to do, and what one of my graduate students did, was take people and have them play a version of this game where it's just a one-off game, that they have the chance to help someone or not, and to find out the payoff or not, and then some other person gets to decide, am I going to trust this person or not, and that's it. And so if all that was going on was this strategic calculation, you shouldn't see any of this uncalculating behavior happening in this situation, because here there's no actual strategic motive anymore. But instead, we found lots of uncalculating cooperation and people trusting the uncalculating cooperators more, and so on. And so this suggests that that's a psychology that developed in the world where these sort of benefits of uncalculating cooperating exist, and that cause it to sort of get internalized as some kind of proximate psychology that says this is a good way to behave. And then so even when you put people in a situation where it doesn't make sense, they keep doing it. And later in the class, we'll also talk about, when we come back to behavioral economics and talk about the sort of distinguish between, rather than self-interest versus social preferences, we're going to talk about the reliance on sort of intuitive, automatic gut responses and emotions versus sort of rational, deliberative thinking. And that's going to be, we're going to see another toolkit for differentiating these kinds of behaviors, which is when you make people stop and think carefully about the situation, if it makes them engage in the behavior less, that suggests that behavior is spilling over from daily life contexts where it makes sense. And we'll talk about that in substantially more detail. Okay, so that's it for today. And next class we'll start really working on evolutionary game theory and looking at how things change over time.